The dust never fully left the air at Firebase Odin. Rena Cole had learned that in her first week, the way the red grit hung in the light between the mahogany trees and settled into everything, her coffee, her rifle case, the seams of her boots. She sat on an ammunition crate at the edge of the helicopter pad, with the case across her knees, not opening it, just resting her hands on the latches, and watched the men load the resupply bird for the ridge patrol. "You lost, augmentee?" That was Boyd. Big through the shoulders, loud in a way that filled a space whether or not anyone wanted it filled. He had a spotter's scope slung across his chest, and a reputation he'd earned honestly, which was the trouble with him. He was good. He knew he was good. He had decided, on the strength of one line in her file, that she was a clerk. They'd handed a long gun to fill a slot. "Not lost," Rena said. "Detachment support." He read it off the manifest like a punchline. "You here to count our brass?" A couple of the younger shooters laughed because Boyd laughed. Rena didn't answer. She turned the case sideways, so the afternoon light caught the moisture beading on its surface, and wiped it dry with her sleeve. Slow, thorough, the way you tend a thing you intend to trust your life to. Her stillness read to Boyd as nothing to say. It was not nothing. It was a woman doing arithmetic on a valley she had already decided she understood better than he did. Somewhere past the wire, a gibbon called, and another answered it from a mile off, and Rena filed the distance without meaning to. 9 days, she said to no one, which was how long the Ridge Patrol was meant to be out. Boyd had already walked away. If you like stories about the people everyone underestimates, right up until the moment they can't, stay with this one, because in about 9 minutes, 300 soldiers are going to look up at a jungle that has gone completely empty and not understand how she did it. Tap subscribe, tell me what city you're listening from, and don't leave before the end. The quiet part is the part that matters. She had not always worked at distance. Before the Army, before any of it, there was a stretch of coast in Oregon, and a man named Errol who ran a salvage boat out of a harbor that smelled of diesel and rockweed. And Errol was her mother's uncle, and the only relative who ever spoke to her, like she'd be worth talking to. He dove for lost gear. Crab pots gone off their buoys in a blow, anchors, once a whole outboard that a tourist had dropped in 40 feet of green water. Rena crewed for him 3 summers, and what he taught her had nothing to do with rifles. "You don't fight the water," he told her, hanging off the gunwale with a coil of line in his fist, the swell lifting the deck under them both. "The water's stronger than you every single day, and it doesn't care. So you learn where it's already going. You put your thing in the current it already has, and you let the ocean carry it where you wanted it anyway." He spat over the side. "Lazy man's strength. Best kind. Anybody strong is just somebody who never learned to read the water." She had been 16. She'd thought he was talking about salvage. He'd also taught her to watch the whole surface, and not the one thing, that a diver in trouble shows up first as a change in the pattern of the water, a wrongness at the edge of the eye, long before it's a shape you can name. Errol was 71 now, and still on the boat, and she owed him a phone call. She had been not making for a year and a half, because the last time they'd spoken, he had asked her when she was coming home to something real, and she had not had an answer, and still did not. That was the shape of the thing she carried out to Odin with her rifle. A number he'd left as a voicemail. "Call me back, kid," that she had listened to 11 times and never returned. It sat in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed. The Army could send her anywhere and solve none of it. The Ridge Patrol went out on a Tuesday. Rena watched them file past the wire, 40 men under a captain named Ed Salter, bound for a string of villages along the high spine of the range, where the maps went vague, and the canopy closed over everything like a green ceiling. Boyd went with them as the senior shooter. Rena stayed back at Odin with the reserve element and the sense, which she did not voice, that the valley they were walking into was too quiet for the number of people supposedly living in it. "You always this cheerful?" This was Nita Osei, the interpreter, a local hire who'd been at Odin longer than anyone in uniform, and who had wandered over to share the shade of the ammunition bunker. She was perhaps 40, unbothered by rank, and she had noticed early that Rena watched the tree line the way the veteran contractors did, in slow sweeps, not in the nervous jerks of the new. "My uncle was cheerfulier," Rena said. "It skipped me." Nita laughed. "You clean that rifle like it owes you money." "It does. It owes me 9 days of being right about a distance I haven't measured yet." Rena held up the bolt to the light, sighted through nothing, set it back. "You want to know a secret, Nita? Everybody out here thinks the hard part is the shot. The shot's the easy part. The shot's just physics finishing a sentence somebody else already started. And the hard part? Knowing which sentence." She grinned, and for a second she wasn't terse at all. She was a woman enjoying herself, in the shade, with someone she liked. "Also, this coffee. This coffee is the hard part. Who hurt this coffee?" Nita snorted. 2 of the reserve shooters drifted over, because the augmentee was funny when Boyd wasn't around to talk over her. And for 20 minutes, she held the shade like a small court, doing an impression of the supply sergeant's filing system and mock-grieving the coffee. And the men laughed and forgot to be surprised that they were laughing. Later, a different hour, the light gone long and orange, the reserve element ran a rehearsal on the range behind the wire, and Rena and a quiet corporal named Frey found themselves working the same wind flag on the 600 line. Neither of them said much. She'd call a value. He'd nod. He'd call 1. She'd adjust half a click off his read and be right. And after the 3rd time, they were simply reading the same air out of the same sky, and knew it about each other without a word. When they packed up, he said, "You've done this somewhere that wasn't a range." And she said, "So have you." And that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. But there was Boyd, too, and the version of Rena he showed the world. The morning the patrol left, he had stood by the pad with a knot of shooters and said, loud enough to carry, "They gave the Overwatch slot to a filing cabinet. If it goes bad up there, pray the filing cabinet can at least call it in before it jams." He'd said it to make the men laugh, and it had worked. Rena had been 40 feet away, cleaning the same rifle, and she had not looked up. And the not looking up was the loudest thing on the pad, if anyone had known how to hear it. Frey saw a thing that evening that he could not explain to himself later. They were breaking down the range gear, and a gust took the stack of steel targets, and one went over and started to roll toward the lip of a drainage ditch, and Rena, walking past with both hands full of gear, put one boot out without breaking stride and stopped it dead against the sole of her foot. Exactly, no scramble, no second try, and kept walking. Frey stood there holding a spool of wire. it was nothing. It was a woman stopping a rolling target with her foot. But something about the economy of it, the way she had known where it would be before it got there, sat in him wrong and would not leave, and he could not have told you why it mattered. It started to matter about 40 hours later. The radio in the operations tent had been running its ordinary low traffic all morning. Position checks, a supply query, the Ridge Patrol calling in from a village called Marceau at the far end of the High Valley. Then it stopped. Not with a scream, with a click, and then the flat hiss of an open channel, and then a voice that was working hard to stay a voice. Odin, Odin, contact, we are... A crackle swallowed the rest. Then, ambush, full valley. They let us all the way in. Salters hit. We are pinned in the Marceau Bowl. No way out the way we came. They've got the high ground on 3 sides. The operations officer was already up. Rena was in the tent doorway. She had felt the channel go wrong before she heard the words, the way you feel a wave lift under a boat. How many? The ops officer said into the handset. Marceau, Odin, how many effectives? How many wounded? Say again your numbers. The answer came back thin and fast. 38 moving. 2 down that we can't move. That's 40. We got 40, Odin. And they're going to bleed us out of this bowl one at a time, unless somebody opens the top of it. 40. Rena heard the number, and it dropped into her like an anchor finding bottom. The commander at Odin was a lieutenant colonel named Pruitt, and he was the man who had signed off on the manifest that put detachment support next to Rena's name and let it stand. And he knew it. And it was written on his face when he came out of the map tent and found her already there. He had doubted her in private. He had let Boyd's version go unchallenged because it was easier. Now the only Overwatch asset inside range was a woman he'd allowed everyone to call a filing cabinet. Cole, he didn't waste it. I read your file wrong. I read it lazy, and I let other people read it lazy. And I don't have time to say it better than that right now. The Marceau Bowl is 31 kilometers by air. And there's exactly one piece of ground that overlooks the top of it that we can put you on. Cadle Spur. It is a bad piece of ground, and you will be alone on it. Can you make a difference from there? Yes. That's all you're going to say. You want more? It'll cost us daylight. She was already moving for the case. Get me on the spur and give me Salter's frequency. I'll do the talking from there. Pruitt keyed the net himself as the light bird spun up. All elements. Odin actual. Overwatch is Cole. She has the net. And Rena's first words on the operations frequency, thumbed out over the rotor wash with the rifle case already open across her knees, were not the words of a filing cabinet. They were flat and even, and they cut straight through the fear on the channel, like a keel through chop. Marceau, this is Overwatch. I hear 40. I'm going to make it 40. Keep them low, and keep them breathing, and give me 9 minutes to get eyes on the top of your bowl. 9 minutes. Count it with me. The bird came in low over the canopy and put her on Catel's spur with a rope and a shove, and then it was gone, hammering back east under the tree line, and the jungle closed its enormous green silence over her. And she was alone, 31 kilometers from anyone who knew her name. Cadle Spur was a knife of black rock pushed up above the canopy, wet with the morning's rain, maybe 30 feet of workable stone, before it dropped away into nothing. From the forward lip, Rena could see the whole architecture of the disaster below her. The Marceau Bowl, a deep, circular hollow in the mountains, with the village at its base, the walls of it rising steep and forested on every side, and the patrol pinned against the near wall with fire coming down on them from 3 arcs of high ground. She lay down in the wet rock and put her eye behind the scope and began, methodically, to take the valley apart. The range to the far wall was 1,340 meters. She read it, believed it, wrote it on the back of her hand in grease pencil, because she did not intend to have to think about it again. The wind she left alone for the moment. It moved through the bowl in a way she did not yet trust, curling, and she would not fire on a wind she did not trust. Marceau, Overwatch. I'm up. I have you. I have the top of your bowl. Tell me where it hurts. Salter's voice, when it came, was a captain's voice, running on discipline over the top of a wound. Overwatch, good to hear you. We've got a gun on the east rim, putting plunging fire right into our casualty position. Can't lift the wounded while it's up. It's dug in behind rock. You're going to have a bad angle. Copy the east gun. Keep your people off that side of the bowl for the next 90 seconds. She found the gun. Salter was right. It was tucked behind a shelf of rock and firing through a notch, and from her angle she could see the notch but not the man behind it. A bad angle. She let it sit and worked the rest of the bowl first, because a shooter who takes the hardest shot first is a shooter who wants a story instead of a result. The first 3 came easier. 3 fighters had crept down the near wall to get grenades onto the patrol, exposed for the length of time it took to move between 2 trees, and she read the curl of the wind by watching a strand of vine sway at the mid-slope where the air actually was. Not at the far wall, not at her own position, but out in the middle where the round would spend its time. And she put all 3 down in the length of a held breath, and the crack of her rifle rolled around the bowl and came back to her doubled off the far wall. 3 off your near wall, she said. That's 37 staying alive down there. Talk to me, Marceau. You just bought us the whole left side, Salter said. How are you real? Ask me later. She was already on to the next problem, and the next problem was worse. The wind shifted. She felt it on the back of her neck before she saw it. A warm push out of the west. And then she watched it arrive in the bowl below her as a slow rolling disturbance in the canopy, and she understood in that instant that the air in the Marceau bowl did not behave like air anywhere else because it was a bowl, and the wind came over the west rim and fell into it and swirled around the inside of the hollow like water going down a drain. A round fired across it would not fly through 1 wind. It would fly through 4. That's going to be a problem, she said, to nobody, to the rock. A knot of fighters rushed the patrol's south flank, and for 90 seconds it was very close, and Rena stopped thinking about the physics of the bowl, and simply worked, fast and flat, reading each shot off the last one, walking her corrections around the swirl by feel, and the rifle ran hot under her hands, and the brass steamed where it landed on the wet stone. When the rush broke, she had held them, but she had spent rounds she'd wanted to keep, and her count of the enemy had gone from a guess to a certainty, and the certainty was not comforting. Marceau, how many wounded that can't walk? 2, Salter, and 1 more. We can carry them if you kill that east gun. We cannot cross the open to reach the extraction LZ while it's up. It's dropping fire right on the only path out. The east gun. The bad angle. she came back to it. And then she did the thing that frightened her, which was to reach for a name and get nothing. Frey, Overwatch. She wanted his eyes. He had a scope and a radio back at Odin, and a repeater might carry her a read on the upper wind. Frey, you got me? I need a wind call off the ridge station. Nothing. Hiss. Frey. Hiss. The channel lay open and empty, and she counted the seconds against it. 1, 2, 3, 4. And each one was a small door closing, and by the 10th second, the emptiness had a texture to it, and she made herself stop calling because a voice calling into nothing is a voice teaching itself to be afraid. She was alone. She had always been going to be alone up here. She said it to the rock the way Errol used to say things to the water. Nobody's coming. Read it yourself. She keyed the net once more, level. Marcel, disregard my last. Work in the east gun now. Hold your wounded. The problem was geometry, and it was ugly. The gun was behind rock. The only line to the man himself ran through the notch, and the notch was a hand's width wide at 1,340 meters, and the wind inside the bowl would not let a round fly straight through it. She could hold on the notch for an hour, and the swirl would push her wide every time. There was no wind she could dial that would be true for the whole flight, because there was no single wind. There were 4. She lay in the wet rock and made herself go still, and she listened to the bowl, and she thought about Errol on the gunwale with a coil of line in his fist. You don't fight the water. You learn where it's already going. She was trying to fight the wind, to punch a round straight through 4 different currents by main force and correction. That was Boyd's kind of strength. That was the strength of a man who never learned to read the water. So, stop fighting it. She stopped thinking about the notch as a straight line to thread and started thinking about the bowl as a body of moving air with a shape, the way the harbor had a shape, the way the current always went somewhere, whether you fought it or not. The wind came over the west rim and fell and rotated clockwise around the inside of the hollow. She could see it now, reading the whole surface the way Errol taught her, watching the canopy move in sequence around the bowl, west first, then north, then east, then south, a slow wheel of disturbed leaves. It was not chaos. It was a current. It had a direction at every point, and the direction at the notch, right at the east rim, was a hard shove from north to south, predictable, the same every time the wheel came around. She did not have to fire a straight round through a crooked wind. She had to fire a crooked round through a wind that would straighten it. She would aim not at the notch, but well north of it, out into the open air off the east rim, and let the round enter the current at the top of its clockwise wheel, and the wind that everyone else was fighting would take the round in its hand and carry it south, curving exactly the way the ocean carried a dropped anchor to the spot you'd already picked, and set it into the notch on the tail of the wheel. Errol, she said quiet to the rock, lazy man's strength. She waited for the wheel. That was the part nobody would have believed if they'd been lying beside her. That having solved it, she then did nothing, for a long time, watching the canopy move around the bowl, timing the rotation. West, north. She counted it around twice to be sure of the rhythm. The disturbance took 11 seconds to travel from the west rim to the east notch. She needed to fire so her round arrived at the notch exactly when the southbound push was strongest, which meant firing when the wheel was at the north rim, 1 beat early, and trusting the wind she could see now to still be there when the round crossed the 1,100 meters of open bowl, a full second and a half after she pressed the trigger. She set her aim 30 feet north of the notch, out over empty air. A hold that looked insane, a hold that would make Boyd laugh out loud. She watched the wheel come around the west rim, disturbing the canopy, and she let out half a breath and held the rest. Marcel, Overwatch, get your carry team on the wounded. When this gun stops, it is not coming back. Move the second it stops. Say again you want us up while it's firing? I want you up in 11 seconds. Count with me. 11. The wheel touched the north rim. She pressed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the round was gone out into the open air on a line to nowhere, 30 feet wide of any target, and for a second and a half it flew through the falling western wind and the turning northern wind and entered the hard southbound shove at the east rim exactly as the wheel arrived there, and the wind she had refused to fight took the round in its hand and bent its flight south, curving it across the last of the distance, and dropped it through a notch, a hand's width wide, and into the gunner behind it. The east gun stopped. The bowl, for one whole second, held its breath. East, gun down, she said. Move, move now. She heard it happen more than saw it. The patrol surging up off the near wall and across the open ground, while the high positions were still understanding that their Overwatch problem had not gone away, and she covered them across every meter of it. And when a fighter rose on the south rim to fire on the running men, she was already there, and he was down before he finished standing. And then the carry teams were into the tree line at the extraction point with both wounded and the number of people who were going to walk out of the Marcau Bowl had stopped falling. Marcau at the LZ, Salter's radio man said. All up. 2 wounded, both breathing. 38 and 2. Overwatch. That's 40. You said 40. Rena lay in the wet rock with her cheek against the stock and did not answer for a moment because her voice was not going to be steady, and she would not put an unsteady voice on the net. 40. She had made it 40. Ate it. The extraction bird came in over the canopy and lifted the patrol out of the tree line above the Marcau Bowl, and Rena covered it up and out, and then Cottle Spur was quiet, and she was alone on 30 feet of black rock 31 kilometers from anyone, and the enormous green silence came back down over everything, and only then did her hands begin to shake. They came for her at last light. She was sitting up by then, the rifle cased, watching the bowl fill with shadow, and when the bird put down on the spur, she stood and walked to it on legs that mostly worked, and nobody in the crew said anything to her, because there was nothing to say that would have fit. At Odin, one of the 2 wounded turned out to be a staff sergeant named Deacon Ruiz, and the other was Captain Ade Salter, and Salter had taken a round through the meat of the thigh that had missed the artery by the width of the thing that decides whether a family gets a phone call. They laid him out in the aid station under the loud, clean light, and a medic worked on the leg while Salter, gray and shaking but very much alive, kept trying to talk. The Overwatch, he said. Where's the Overwatch? Somebody get me the... I need to know who was on that net. You need to hold still, sir. I need to know who threaded that gun. That was not a shot. That was a... I've been doing this 11 years. That was not a shot a person makes. Rena came in out of the dark, still smelling of cordite and wet stone, and Ruiz, Deacon Ruiz, the other wounded man, laid out on the next cot with his shoulder packed and his eyes too bright. turned his head and looked at her, and said the thing that everyone in the bowl had wanted to ask. Am I going to make it, or are you just being nice? And Rena, who didn't do hope, crouched down by his cot so he could see her face, and told him a fact. The round went through the top of your shoulder and out the back. It missed everything that kills you. You've got a wife somewhere? Portland. His voice cracked in it. We were going to... She's due in March. I'm supposed to... I told her I'd be there. I told her. March, Rena said. You're going to be there in March. That's not me being nice. That's me telling you where the round went. She put her hand flat on his chest, over the sternum, the same hand that had done the impossible thing 1,100 meters out, doing close, careful work now, holding a frightened man to the earth. Breathe with me. In. That's it. You're going home to Portland. Say it. I'm going home to Portland. March, she said. Say March. March. The Board of Inquiry, because there is always a board, because a woman labeled detachment support does not put a curving round through a notch at 1,340 meters without somebody in a clean uniform needing to understand how, arrived 3 days later in the person of a major named Holbrook, who had flown in from the regional headquarters with a folder and a face that had already decided what kind of thing it was looking at. He set the folder on the table between them in the operations tent. Rena sat across from him with her hands flat on her knees. Sergeant Cole. He opened the folder. I've read your file. A lot of people have read my files, sir. It's a popular file. Your qualifications on paper are unremarkable. Support role, augmentee, no competition record, no schoolhouse honors, no... He turned a page. Nothing that would predict what 40 men are telling me happened in the Marsau Bowl. So you understand my difficulty. I have a record that describes one person and a valley full of witnesses describing another. One of them is wrong. Or the file's just short, sir. Walk me through the East Gun. So she did. Not the way you'd tell it in a bar. The way you'd tell it to a man who thought you would lying, flat, mechanical. The range, the notch, the swirl of the wind falling into the bowl and turning clockwise. The 11-second wheel, the hold 30 feet north into open air. The trust that the current she could read would still be there a second and a half later to carry the round south and drop it through the notch. She talked, and Holbrook stopped turning pages. You aimed 30 feet off the target, he said. I aimed at where the wind was going. The target was just where the wind was going to end up. She shrugged one shoulder. My uncle ran a salvage boat. You don't fight the water, sir. You put your thing in the current it already has. The bowl was a current. I read it and I used it. Anybody who'd spent 3 summers pulling crab pots out of the wrong tide would have seen the same thing. Holbrook looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed the folder and turned it face down on the table, which is the smallest gesture in the world, and meant that the version of her printed inside it was no longer the version he believed. No, Sergeant, he said quietly. They wouldn't have. That's the part your file doesn't survive contact with. Anybody could have read the wind. Exactly one person out here fired a round they knew would miss and trusted the mountain to fix it. He stood. I came here to reconcile a discrepancy. There's no discrepancy. There's just a file that was written by someone who never watched you work. That night the generator failed around 2, and the whole fire base went dark and quiet. And Rena, who was not sleeping and had given up pretending she would, sat out on the same ammunition crate at the edge of the pad in the dark. After a while, Salter came out on a crutch and a great deal of stubbornness, and lowered himself down beside her with a grunt. And they sat in the dark for a while, and neither of them said anything. And the jungle made its enormous night noise all around the wire. "I keep doing the arithmetic," Salter said finally. 40 of us in that bowl. You put down. I don't even know the count. And every single one of us walked or got carried out. And I keep landing on the fact that I marched all 40 of us into that bowl in the first place. They let us all the way in, Cole, all the way to Marceau. And I didn't feel it. You would have felt it. You were 400 kilometers away, and you'd have felt it. Rena was quiet a moment. Then she said the things she had told nobody, not the medic, not Hallbrook, not the crew that pulled her off the spur. When I called for Frey, on the net, during. She watched the dark tree line. I needed a wind read, and I called his name, and there was nothing there, just the open channel. And I kept calling it, 4, 5 times. And there was a second, right in there, where I wasn't a shooter anymore. I was just a person on a rock, a very long way from anybody, calling a name into nothing, and nobody was coming. And I understood that nobody was ever going to come. And I had to do the whole thing alone, or watch 40 people die listening to me try. She let out a breath. I've never been that alone in my life. And the thing I can't put down is I liked it. Some ugly part of me liked being the only one there. What does that make me? Salter was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was not comfort. It was truth, which is a rarer thing. It makes you the person we needed on that rock, he said. You think the rest of us don't have that ugly part? Mine's just never been useful. Yours was the only thing standing between 40 people and the ground. You didn't like being alone, Cole. You liked being enough. Those aren't the same thing, and you've been carrying them like they are. He shifted his bad leg. You were enough. Let that be what it was. She didn't answer, but something in her chest that had been clenched since the spur let go by a fraction, and in the dark he could hear it, the small change in her breathing, and he was kind enough not to say anything about it. The voicemail was still on her phone. Call me back, kid. She'd listened to it 11 times, and never once dialed the number. And in the days after the bowl, she found herself taking the phone out and looking at Errol's name and putting it away again. And the not calling had a different weight now, because she had spent a second and a half of her life trusting a current to carry a thing exactly where she'd aimed it. And she absolutely knew, that Errol had built that trust in her on a gunnel off the Oregon coast when she was 16, and she had never told him so. She kept not calling. And then one afternoon, Nita Osei sat down next to her on the crate, uninvited, the way Nita did everything, and looked at the phone in Rena's hands. You've been staring at that thing for a week. It's a voicemail from my uncle. He asked me to call him back a year and a half ago. And I don't have the thing he wants me to say. He wants me to come home to something real. And I don't have an answer, so I've just not called for a year and a half. Because I'd rather owe him the call than call him and have nothing. She said it and heard how it sounded. Nita did not tell her about a coincidence. Nita did not turn out to know Errol, or come from the same coast, or hold some perfect key. Nita had been reading people in this valley for 20 years, across 4 different armies, and she simply knew the shape of this from the outside. The way you know a knot is going to hold or slip before you pull it. You think you have to bring him an answer, Nita said. You've decided the call is a report. It has to have findings. She shook her head. He didn't ask you to come home with an answer. He asked you to call him back. Those are different jobs, Rena. You keep trying to fire the straight round through the crooked wind. Just call the man. Let the current carry the rest. He's 71. The answer's not what he's short of. Rena sat with that. It was the same lesson, she realized. It had always been the same lesson. You don't fight the water. She had used it to save 40 people, and she had not once thought to use it on herself. She called him that evening, standing out past the wire, with the last of the light going green and gold over the canopy. He picked up on the fourth ring, gruff, and when he heard her voice, he was quiet for a second. And then he said, well, and that was all, and it turned out Nita was right. The answer was not what he had been short of. He just wanted to hear that she was on the far side of whatever she'd been doing out there. She didn't tell him about the bowl. She told him she'd been thinking about the salvage boat, about the current, about how she'd finally understood the thing he'd been trying to teach her when she was 16 and thought he was talking about crab pots. Took you long enough, Errol said, and she could hear him grinning, 71 years old, and grinning off the Oregon coast. I'll leave the light on the dock, kid. No rush. Boat's not going anywhere, and neither am I. She stood out past the wire, long after the call ended, holding the phone, and the stone she'd swallowed a year and a half ago was just gone, dissolved like it had never been anything but the not calling all along. Boyd apologized on a Thursday. He'd had to work up to it, and the working up had cost him. In the days after the bowl, he'd gone very quiet, which, for Boyd, was its own kind of loud, and then he'd volunteered for the worst detail on the firebase, a 2-day security posting on a leech-infested observation point that everyone dodged, and had done it without being asked and without telling anyone why, which was a thing Rena only learned about later, and never from him. He came across the yard to her in the afternoon heat while she was cleaning the rifle, and he stood there for a while, not saying anything, and then he started 3 times. I want to... He stopped. The thing I said, on the pad, the filing cabinet thing. He stopped again. His jaw worked. I've been running my mouth about people I hadn't watched work my whole career, and I got away with it every time, because I was usually right. And being usually right is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a man, because it lets him stop looking. And I looked at your file, and I stopped looking. And 40 people, almost. He couldn't finish it. He tried a 4th time, and it came out smaller. I called you a thing that jams, in front of the men, and then you did the hardest piece of shooting I have ever seen a human being do, and I have to live the rest of my life knowing I'd already decided you couldn't. Rena set the bolt down. She looked at him for a moment, and she did not make it cheap, and she did not make it cost him more than it already had. Then keep looking, she said. Boyd nodded. It was 3 words, and it was the exact right size, and he took it and walked back across the yard, and something between them was not fixed exactly, but it was true now, which was better. The letter came for her in the 2nd week, forwarded up through channels, handwritten on paper, that had been folded and unfolded many times before it ever reached an envelope. It was from a woman named Carol Ruiz in Portland, and it had no military vocabulary in it at all. Deacon told me what you said, the letter read. He said, you put your hand on his chest and told him he was coming home for March. He said you didn't say it like a wish. He said you said it like you were reading it off a wall. I don't know what you do out there, and I don't want to. I just know my daughter is going to have her father in the room when she's born, because a woman I will never meet decided the math worked out. I've read your name 100 times. Rena. I say it to the baby. I tell her, that's the one. That's the one who sent your daddy home. Rena read it standing up and then had to sit down. She did not know how to hold a thing like that. She had a fact she'd told a frightened man on a cot, and it had traveled 3,000 miles and become the first story a child not yet born would ever be told about her. And there was no procedure for that, no flat mechanical language that fit it, and she sat on the ammunition crate with the letter in her hand and let it be enormous. The recognition, when it came, was not a parade. But 300 soldiers had rotated through Firebase Odin by the end of that month. The Ridge Patrol and the Reserve Element and 2 companies that came up to relieve them, and heard the story the way stories move through a firebase, hand to hand, growing. And on the day the colonel formed them up in the yard, to mark the end of the deployment, he called her out by name in front of all of them, and told them plainly, in his own words, that he had signed the manifest that called her detachment support, and that he had been wrong, and that the 38 men of the Marceau Patrol were alive because he had been forced to trust the person he'd allowed everyone to write off. And then he stopped talking, and the yard did the thing. It started at the back, with the Ridge Patrol, the ones who'd been in the bowl. Salter got up first, off his crutch, and it cost him, you could see it cost him to get to his feet on that leg. And he came to attention, and next to him Ruiz stood with his arm still in a sling, and then the whole patrol was up, and then it moved forward through the formation like the wheel of wind moving around the bowl. One section standing, and then the next, 300 soldiers coming to their feet in a yard, gone completely silent, and there was no cheering. That was the thing Rena would remember. There was no sound at all except boots. 300 pairs of boots, and then nothing. Boyd was in the second rank, and he stood with the rest, and he did not look away from her, which for Boyd was the whole apology all over again. Frey stood at the end of a row with his jaw tight. Nita Osei, who was not a soldier and did not have to stand for anyone, stood. And Rena, at the front of it, barely moved. She came to attention because that was what her body knew how to do. And she looked back at the 300 faces looking at her, and she held very still, and the silence went on, and it was the loudest thing that had ever happened to her. Frey found her afterward, by the pad, when the formation had broken and the yard was clearing. He'd been carrying something around since the range, since the rolling target and the boot, and now he finally had the words for it. I saw you stop a target with your foot once, he said, weeks ago, before any of this. It rolled off the stack, and you stopped it dead without looking and kept walking, and it bugged me for a month because I couldn't figure out why it stuck with me. He shook his head. I figured it out. It's the same thing you did on the spur. You didn't chase it. You knew where it was going to be, and you just put your foot there and waited for it to arrive. That's the whole thing about you, isn't it? Everybody else chases. You get to where it's going, and you wait. Rena almost smiled. My uncle would have liked you, she said. 14 months later, there was a range in Georgia, hot and flat, and nothing at all like the bowl. And Rena Cole stood on the 600 line in the wet Georgia morning and watched a wind flag she did not entirely trust, and thought about calling its value early. She was an instructor now, which she had not asked to be and could not fully escape, because the story had arrived in Georgia before she did, the way it now arrived everywhere before she did, and there was no room she could walk into on that post where somebody didn't already know what she'd done in a valley they couldn't pronounce. She'd stopped fighting that too. It came in the door ahead of her, and she'd learned to just let it be in the room. She noticed she was doing the thing again. Every time before she fired, on any range, in any weather, she found herself reading the whole field of wind, and not just the flag in front of her, sweeping the entire distance, the near grass, the mid-slope, the far berm, taking the whole surface apart, the way Errol had taught her to read a harbor, the way she'd read the bowl. She did it now without deciding to. Somebody had pointed it out to her once, gently. The way you mention a thing to a person who doesn't know they do it. And she'd only shrugged, because it wasn't superstition, and it wasn't a tic. It was just that she could no longer look at moving air and see only one piece of it. The bowl had done that to her. She read the whole water now, always, everywhere, and she always would. Deacon Ruiz sent a photograph that spring. A baby girl in Portland, red-faced and furious at the camera, and on the back in Carol's handwriting, "She's here." He was in the room. March, like you said. Her name is going to be a normal name, but between us we call her the one you sent him home for. Rena kept it in the lid of the rifle case, where she'd see it every time she opened the latches, and she did not tell anyone it was there. Salter had made Major and taken a company of his own, and he'd written her once to say he'd changed, how he moved units through unfamiliar ground, that he felt the shape of a valley before he entered it now, that he'd learned it too late in the Marceau Bowl and never wanted to learn it that way again, but was grateful, in a bent kind of way, to have learned it at all. And Nita Osei was still at a fire base somewhere, reading people across whatever army came through, and she and Rena traded a message every few months, and the last one had just said, "You called your uncle?" And Rena had written back one word, which was often, and could hear Nita's snort from 6,000 miles away. There was a young shooter on the Georgia line that morning, struggling, chasing the flag, correcting and overcorrecting and correcting again, punching straight rounds into a wind that would not let them fly straight. Rena watched for a while. Then she walked down the line and crouched next to the shooter, and did not tell the story, and did not repeat any lesson that had ever been said to her, because that lesson was Errol's, and it was hers, and it was not a thing to hand out on a range in Georgia like a piece of candy. She said something smaller and truer to the moment. "Stop punching the wind," she said. "You can't win that fight. Nobody can. Find where the air's already going and put your round in that." The shooter looked at the flag and then looked at the whole field, really looked, maybe for the first time, the near grass, the mid-slope, the far berm, and something in the young face changed, and the next round flew where it was supposed to. Rena straightened up and walked back down the line, level-eyed, unhurried, a woman getting to where the thing was going and waiting for it to arrive. And the Georgia wind moved across the range in its long, invisible current, and she read all of it, the whole surface at once, the way she now always would. And she was, for the first time in a long time, entirely at peace.